welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes. And then I say Luxembourg in Luxembourg, but not this time because this is a SciLux original, which means we are talking about European science and we're talking with a European scientist. And this time we're going closer to my hometown, actually, and closer to my home country as well, because we're in Czech Republic. And our guest today is Professor Kateřina Chládková, who is an assistant professor at Faculty of Arts, Charles University, and a senior scientist at Institute of Psychology, Czech Academy of Sciences. She investigates speech and language development throughout lifetime. Kateřina, thank you so much for coming today.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Me too, because it's the second time I'm discussing linguistics and languages, and I'm always very excited because it is my background. Sometimes I have scientists and they're like, you're talking about physics. What is your background? Is it physics? No. So I don't always reveal it today. I can, and I'm very happy to discuss it. So where do we start? Well, from the beginning, of course, right? So recently you wrote an article on the conversation. I'm going to also put a link in the show notes to that. And the title of the article was How to Learn a Language Like a Baby. So how do we do that?
How to learn a language like a baby? Well, the question is, many adults would ask, is it possible to learn a language like a baby? I'm not a baby anymore, right? I think it's worth trying because when we look at how adults normally learn languages, it's not always a very pleasant process. They often get frustrated because they find themselves unable to not only to speak, but also to understand, like in conversational settings and connected speech. And that might not be because they are adults, because they are older than the babies or older than the children because of their age, but it might be because of the method that they are using to learn languages. Most often as adults, also when we are like school-age children, what we often do is we take language textbooks and we try to read the new language and learn vocabulary by heart, memorize grammar rules, and then we try to apply them in the real language settings when trying to converse with someone, when trying to speak the language. But it's not so straightforward because, we can very well memorize the rules and memorize the words and repeat them from memory, but to use them in real life, that's a different story. And as children, we learn our native language in a very different way. We never take a word list or a list of grammar rules, but we just learn by living in the language. And that's why also it's easier then to apply the language that we learned in the real life. We're not really applying any rules or memorized words. We just use the language as we learned it. And that's how babies learn. So they learn the language by living in the language community and by just implicitly soaking up everything that's around them, not only linguistic. And as adults, we do have these mechanisms, these learning mechanisms in our brain and in our body. So technically, we're able to learn languages like this, but we never do it because also we have biases and prejudices. Well, I'm not a baby anymore. I can't do it like this. But research from the lab shows that technically our brains can do it. And the way is now to switch the switch in our heads and think differently and open our mind and I'll try it. I won't just think about the language and learn the language for the sake of it, but I will just try to soak up everything that's around me in this new language and learn the language like a baby does.
So I have learned a couple of languages in my life, and I was just wondering, isn't it already done? In a way, some of the methods I've met, let's say in my language learning, were a little bit like that. You have this total immersion. You have really, you need to go to the country to learn the language and so on and so forth.
Yes, these immersive methods, they are implemented. Aspects of it are implemented in many methods that are being used. But many people, when it comes to mainly foreign language learning, so learning the language not in the setting of the target country or language community, but in your own country, like learning a foreign language that's spoken elsewhere, most of the methods still rely heavily on aspects that are not so immersive and so naturalistic, which is like reading from the very start of learning the language. It might be one of the biggest obstacles at actually becoming a fluent speaker. And also the view of learning a language is very often well, I'm learning the language for the sake of it, and I have to grade myself. I have to like summarize how many words I learned today, and I have to be able to take them from my memory, like as a word list. People are often also not motivated only by, or mostly by, wanting to live in the new culture or in the new language when they are like in this foreign language learning setting, but really learning the language for the sake of it.
So wait a second, vocabulary lists are not okay?
Oh, well, I mean, at one point, when you reached a certain kind of proficiency, I would say it doesn't do much harm to really learn new words by memorizing them and by searching them in the dictionary. But certainly at the start of the language learning, vocabulary lists wouldn't help much because they give you isolated words out of context. And one thing is, between any two languages, one-to-one translation doesn't work. So even if you like learn the name for a table or for a chair, which might be more or less one-to-one translation in many language pairs, then you learn it in an isolated position, and you might not be able to find a word when someone starts speaking to you, like in connected, pretty fast speech. You might not even be able to find where the word was. So as babies or as children, how we learn is we learn by multi-word chunks. So we're not chunking the speech into individual words, which is what we do often as adults. But our brains, they just trace the acoustically prominent chunks, and they are often not isolated words. It might be like a noun and an adjective, or a determiner and a noun. And children learn those first, and only much later, for some even at school age, they come to realize they are actually what we think of as separate words when we actually learn to read and write. Learning isolated words by heart at the start of language learning is no way like babies or like children learn their native language. And it also doesn't help much at really coming to get a grip of understanding connected speech and of being able to speak the language yourself.
I have a lot of questions right now, but the first one is, how many years do babies actually have to get to a moment when they start speaking the language? Do we really have this luxury as adults to go through that process where we have a guided learning of a person that is patient, assuming that all the parents are patient all the time, and gives us all the feedback and repeats, and we can have the context and we can look at the word and then assume, probably that's it?
Yeah, I mean, that's another big difference that you're mentioning between babies and adults. Children do take a lot of time to start speaking. So it takes about a year before they start like saying the first words or the first word chunks. Yeah, it would make sense for the adults to wait a bit as well. What children do, why they take so long to start actually speaking, is not only because the language is totally new for them, so they have to learn to understand it first, but also because their muscles and their articulatory tract, their vocal tract, the motor coordination is not so well developed yet. So also outside language. So they have to develop this along learning to understand the language. And they also have to learn to coordinate breathing, because for being able to speak, you have to coordinate your breathing in an efficient way so that you can pronounce what you want to pronounce. As adults, we don't have to learn to coordinate the breathing for the new language because that's universal. We also have like a good grip of our muscles, but it still wouldn't make sense to start by listening only and by learning to understand not necessarily all the meanings of what's being said, but getting sensitized to the language, especially to its rhythm and to its melody, because this is an aspect that differs between languages, the language rhythm, the speech rhythm, and the melody. And that's also one of the things that makes us sound non-native and maybe be less fluent and maybe less comprehensible when we speak a foreign or second language, is that we speak in the rhythm of our native language, but we use the words of the foreign language. And this might seem totally or come totally incomprehensible to a native speaker of the target language, because also that speaker is searching for the rhythm of their language.
To summarize, still circling back to the how to learn like a baby. So we're talking about not really making chunks, but somehow seeing a full sentence as one, or at least certain words together, right? We're talking about tuning into this rhythm and characteristic of the language. Anything else that is so special about babies?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to summarize it, how to learn like a baby. So it's one thing I said, well, not start by reading and not necessarily immediately by speaking the language, which is totally new to you. And when you're like starting with listening to the language, what babies do is they listen globally. So really just not trying to search for any individual words, but attune to the rhythm and to the melody, to the very global aspects of the language. And then the multi-word chunks, like the acoustically coherent pieces, will crystallize for you just by listening, because your brain will detect the acoustically prominent patterns or the patterns that belong together. And then as you're getting tuned in to the language and detecting these chunks, and you also observe the situations and the context, your brain will start connect the meanings out of the situation and the context with these acoustic chunks that it's detecting and hearing. So really starting big and then only later coming to the smaller pieces, maybe when you're tuned in enough and you can like detect the phrases and you detect that there was a chunk that you heard also before, and you're able to start connecting the meanings, only then maybe it makes sense to, if at all, to take the word list and try to learn new vocabulary.
And how do you know that? The babies cannot tell you, okay, now I'm actually analyzing the speech like that. How are you sure that this is how babies process the language?
Yeah, that's over half a century of language acquisition research. It's shown that babies do start by, well, the first thing they learn about their native language is its prosody, that's the rhythm and melody together. So really these global aspects. And that's research that looks at behavioral responses of a baby or the neural activity. And various experiments have shown that children also are much better at learning, for instance, these multi-word chunks, children who are not literate yet, these multi-word chunks than isolated words, for instance. And also there's no one like to tell a baby, hey, this chunk or this prosodic word, it means a dog, right? They just listen to it. They have to detect this chunk in a connected speech, which is not a trivial task, because like there's no pauses between words when we speak like this. And if there are, maybe they are not at word boundaries, but within words. But it's okay for a brain because it can like statistically compute what's most likely a word. And then no one tells the baby, well, this word dog means like this furry animal which barks. But because they are like observing the situations around them, and then in the speech they hear these sounds, dog, dog, they often appear when there's also this animal inside, they figure out that's probably what this acoustic chunk means.
So if babies are so tuned in to the native language, does it mean they also prefer speakers of their native language, native speakers of the language?
Yeah, when they are very young, babies have like what we call familiarity preference. So they prefer things that are familiar. And because they start by learning these global aspects, so they recognize the rhythm and melody of their native speech very early on. And they also prefer listening to it when they are very young. They also prefer listening to their mother's voice over a voice of a different woman.
Even if she doesn't speak her native language?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know.
Yeah, I was
I
just
don't even know
wondering.
if someone has researched this.
Another research question for you.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to inspire, but I think it would be very interesting. Also because I'm connecting from Luxembourg, and of course we have a lot of research into multilingualism, right? And recently I was also interviewing a psychologist, actually a person specializing in numerical cognition, because we have a lot of discussion about the fact that language influences the ability to learn maths, for example. because exactly you don't do maths in your native language, and somehow then it really influences how fast you learn the mathematics. So yes, just mentioning that because of course this is a classic discussion in our context. Okay, so before we switch into adults, because I have a few questions about adults, I think it's a good moment to ask the pub quiz question to finish off the topic of babies, at least for now. So if you can ask the question, and listener, remember the answer only at the end of the podcast.
Okay, so the question is, at what age do babies start learning their native language?
And as I said, answer only at the end. So we talked about this whole idea of tuning into a language. And one of the studies you actually made was focusing on Czech speakers that were listening to Maori, right? So how did it go? What did you discover?
So this was a study that we did to see whether adults are still possible to tune in to the rhythm and melody of a new language in a similar way as they did for the native language when they were babies, right? As everybody who's a normal hearing person did for the native language when they were babies. Also, because as I said before, like this rhythm and melody is one of the hardest things to learn using the more traditional methods in classroom-based learning. Some researchers would even say it's unlearnable, like this prosody, the melody and rhythm, and some say it's only learnable with very much drill and practice. But it's not how babies do it, right? It just comes to them almost out of the blue. So we wanted to see whether adults are able to learn in such an implicit way to tune in to the rhythm and melody of a new language. So that's why we took almost 200 Czech adults, native Czech speakers in adulthood, and we played them Maori, which was an unknown language for them. There were a couple of people who recognized it, so we had to exclude them. And we played them the Maori Harry Potter audiobook for 5 minutes. And there were 4 groups of listeners. One group only got the audio, so they just sat behind the computer and listened for 5 minutes. And 3 other groups got also the writing, the written form of the language. So one of those groups got like the original Maori script. It's an Latin alphabet-based script. The other group got also a kind of Maori script, but we played around with it and we made it less transparent. So the original or the Maori script is transparent, which means that words or sounds are written in one-to-one correspondence. So an A sound is always written with the A letter, for instance. And then the other condition was we made it more English-like, so a bit less transparent. So you could have A, which was written as an A or also as an O. And then the last group, they got a Hebrew script, like the Maori sounds transcribed with Hebrew letters. And we wanted to see whether being exposed to the written form of the language along with the audio modulates the ability of tuning in to the rhythm and melody. And first, we found that overall, people were able to tune in to the new language. And we found out by asking them after the 5 minutes of listening, we played them very short excerpts of Maori, again, by a different speaker, and of Malay, which is a very similar language, but a different language than Maori. And these excerpts, they were filtered. So they were edited in such a way that only the rhythm and melody were audible. So the words were no longer audible as in the training. So if people did tune in to the melody and rhythm, they would be able to recognize the language afterwards. And they were able to recognize it above chance, all of them, like all the 4 groups. But what we also found, so amazing, right? Only after 5 minutes, they just recognized this completely new language based only on its rhythm and melody. And they were not told beforehand, focus on the rhythm or melody or whatsoever. But the groups that had these more complicated scripts, like the English-like Maori spelling, and also the Hebrew letters, they were much worse. They were significantly worse at tuning in than the group who only had audio. So these results show that our brains are still able to tune into rhythm and melody of a new language when they get a chance to listen to it, and that this ability gets worse when we also expose ourselves to the letters, to the written form of the language.
This is really fascinating. Although I have to be a devil's advocate, and I probably know that this is not your research, so you will not be able to answer to me. But tuning in is one thing, but reproduction then?
So this is only like a very beginning. We want to find out whether adults are really able to go through the whole language learning process in the same way or in a very similar way as they did as babies for their native language. And this is the starting point. So now we know they can do the beginning. And of course, whether they can then also sound more like the speaker of the target language if they wish to. That's a question for further research. I mean, there are studies appearing and also from our university that actually drilling and training your production can help. But we think you might not even to drill, and by tuning your brain so early at the very start to this new language, it will just bootstrap all the further grammar and language levels, the understanding of the language, and it could also bootstrap your own speaking, but we still have to find out.
This is really interesting. I will definitely be checking what you find out later on because, I had to drill a lot. So, of course, it did help me, but also I had people who were there with me in those laboratories and it did not help them, right? So, of course, there's a discussion of motivation. Of course, there's a discussion of talent, as you're saying here in this particular case. If all people can actually recognize it, then maybe we're onto something that is bigger than what we're doing in linguistics and research right now, because somehow, I also had to teach languages at a certain moment. And I did have those students when I was like, I really want to believe they will learn one day, but I just give up, right? I mean, there are people who somehow seem not to be able to, which is counterintuitive because, again, as you're saying, they learned their native language as a baby. So why isn't it working this way, right? So it's very fascinating research.
Absolutely.
For sure.
I really believe in this initial phase because that's what so far also in all these immersive teaching methods has been missing. And it really seems to be like the stepping stone into language for babies. So if we give this stepping stone to adults, maybe like miracles could happen and everyone could like feel very good speaking a new language and also be understood by the other people. With this rhythm and melody, we also talked about speaking earlier on. What we also think might help is that instead of starting speaking words or meaningful sentences, what could help adults is to try babble first. Because it's also what babies do very early on before they even start speaking. They do this ba 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 ba, right? And that's rhythmic. That's babbling in the rhythm of the language. And babies also cry in the melody of the language. So we might not need to force adults crying in a new language, but just trying to speak something, but not really meaningful, really trying to tune into the rhythm, not only with ears, but also with how you say syllables.
Although I can already imagine all the adults, right? Because as you're saying, it's not only doing the research and finding out, but also then convincing people to actually follow such a method, right? Because of course, we have all those years of things drilled into our heads about how the language should be studied, right? So
Absolutely.
It's not going to be very easy.
Yeah. We also want to understand why the language is as it is, right? Because we just want to analyze everything and like understand 100% of what's going on here.
And also what I see is what always fascinated me is that although we have studies on how language is supposed to be taught, let's say, different languages are still taught very differently. It's very cultural and somehow, for example, in my opinion, English is at the forefront in many ways because it does kind of try to teach you a language that is closer to the way people speak. But then if I look at, for example, French, it was always a shocking thing for me that first you do this school French and whatever, then you go in the street and you absolutely, because of connected speech, understand zero, because it has really nothing to do with the way people use the language.
Yeah, I have never really thought about how the cross-linguistic differences in language teaching, but there will definitely be a big difference in how English is taught and how other languages are taught, because English is just the lingua franca of not only like the professional settings, but also like games and everything and vacationing. And you also meet non-native speakers of the language everywhere. So the input is really varied if you want to learn from a naturalistic input. And you were saying about this, like this is all research and we know that this might work for adults. But the other question is, would they want to do it this way? And it's one of the biggest obstacles, I think, because we're co-developing this mobile language learning app, Movies. And we have these UX sessions, like asking the actual users what they think and how they like it. And we don't have so much trouble convincing them that this baby-like way of language learning could actually be what brings them to the language and what makes them fluent speakers eventually. So they have no troubles believing that. But when we ask them, so would you do it? Well, not really. Like listening only for a few weeks and then babbling. They believe it might work, but many of them are really like not into doing it. So that's a huge thing, like convincing people to actually try it this way.
Yeah, I would, in case you need someone.
Thank you.
But of course, this is research, right? So you look rather to the non-convinced people and not the ones that already know Maori, for example. I don't, but just out of curiosity. But then again, you are right. This is a big thing and a big question as well, because of, going back in general to the educational system as such, that makes us believe that you have to tick the boxes, right? All the grading that you've achieved this level because you are able to, right? And then you have all the reading and writing and whatever. And I still see it also now with some parents of my kids' friends, is that they somehow complain about certain methods because they're exactly not seeing them taught the way they were used to in the past in the school, and that's the only way to do it, right? So all these homework, revision, learning by heart, all this stuff, there's so much in there. It's a kind of a Pandora box, I think you're opening there, right? To convince people.
Yeah. I mean, with the school age children, we're also trying to educate school teachers and show them like which methods might be more suitable in general, but also like for the cognitive and mental development of children. And it's this natural method, right? Even more important for children and for adults. There are many teachers who actually are proponents of this method and they try to do it in their classes, but then they come in clash with these kinds of parents who want to see progress and who ask their children, what did you learn today? And when the child is not able to quantify, then they're unhappy with the method being used.
And you're also going against, I will not name, but some very popular apps that are very, very used by many people, which are all about scoring and games and exactly actually recalling things and being able to write them. So, it's a task.
That's a very good gaming app. What we're talking about, like the most widespread app for language teaching. I mean, it's a good gaming thing, but it doesn't really teach you the language. And many users actually are telling, well, I like it because I have like a streak of 500, but I don't actually know the language. It's a different thing than language learning.
Yeah. Which again reminds me also of the beginnings of my language learning, which was exactly that. Yeah, I got a amazing grade, but I can barely speak the language, right? This very, very old methods of just sitting in front of a book and then, I don't know, reading things out loud and doing grammar exercises.
Yeah, that's what many people experience. So they start learning the language in this classroom setting in their home country, and they can get like perfect grades for close tests and for vocabulary tests and everything. Then they come to the country and they're unable to understand, so they're completely lost. But then many report that after like 3 months or so living in the country, they feel like a switch has been switched and they begin to understand everything and they are able to speak fluently. And I think this is because they had this immersion time in this culture, in this language community. And also like they got the chance, their ears and brains got the chance to tune in to the language finally after having learned all the grammar rules. And that's what actually boosts their understanding and also their speaking, what makes them able to speak and understand.
Normally in the podcast, I also have a moment when we define some terms that are very, very typical. Here we are closer to the people, let's say, so we're not really using all the official terms, maybe some fossilization at certain moment, but in general, that's more or less what we've done. So thank you for that. This is very good communication, but I still want to push for something that I actually loved at university. I loved phonetics and phonology. That was one of my favorite things, really. But many people don't like it. So I know you're also specialized. You specialize in this, and you study phonetics and phonology. But that's just isolated sounds, right? We're just talking about this whole, idea of not chunking things, and then you also study isolations, just that vowel sound in something. How does it go together?
Well, phonetics and phonology, it's by no way only studying isolated sounds. So phonetics is the study of the sound level of the language, so how things are pronounced, but not only and how they sound acoustically, how you can measure them acoustically, what acoustic properties speech sounds have, and those differ across languages. But it's also like how rhythm is realized. So what are the cues to rhythm? Is it that there's like a stressed syllable in every word in a language, and how is that prominence or that stress realized? It could be like louder, it could be more intensive, it could be longer. And in some languages there are no word stresses, like in French, for instance, or in Czech also. So it's only like one word in a whole phrase that is stressed, but not the individual words. So this is all that it's all studied by phonetics, so also these like more global aspects of speech. And then phonology, that's the grammar of the sounds. So phonology is not really how we pronounce it, but how the sounds or the rhythms and melodies combine in our mental grammar. So whether this is really difficult to explain in layman terms. So it's not how an a or a p is pronounced, but what happens when you put together an a and p. It could change, for instance, and this is what phonology studies. But again, not only for isolated words, but also, for instance, how these word stresses interact with how individual sounds are realized and whether they are realized at all, for instance.
Okay. And do we know also how it works for babies then?
The phonetics and phonology. That's a very interesting question. So babies, very small babies, they start from bottom up. So they start from the acoustic signal. So they start with the phonetics of the language. And once they come a bit farther and start to uncover relations in the speech, I think they start building their phonology. They also, what they do for the speech, they have all these various speech sounds, and you have many different speech sounds in languages and across languages, and it differs between languages whether a particular difference is meaningful in the language or not. So what very little babies are very busy doing is they try to uncovering which of those acoustic differences that they hear are meaningful and which do not. So which sounds clustered together and which make one category, and which sounds do not cluster together and belong to two different categories. And in a way, this is already doing phonology. So you're abstracting away from the concrete acoustic properties of the sounds.
So I'm not surprised they do all those tantrums later on. That's a lot of work,
Yeah,
right?
then maybe that's why.
Maybe that's one of the reasons. Just don't tune in too much. Just take it easy today, right? Well, we can't really control that, I guess. But it's true. I always remember when I went to a language course in a different foreign country, and I was living with a family as well, just to get, more and more. And I couldn't sleep because of all the processing that the brain had to do, right? Because I would just close my eyes and I just heard all those words and everything, and it just was impossible. So the process is there. It's real for sure. And the same for the babies, because it's not only that they're learning actually, right? Because there are other things they're learning in the meantime as well, right? What about the sounds that the animals make? So, we have, I think you studied some parrots as well, right? When you looked at that, this is also something you can look at from the same perspective as we were discussing small babies, how they learn to reproduce, how they learn to tune in to sounds.
Well, there's animals which are very similar to humans in their vocal learning abilities. So that's one of the capabilities that actually makes us have our language as we have it. There's, of course, the usual suspects, parrots and other songbirds, but also seals, for instance, have very good vocal learning abilities. And seals, they have also very good rhythmic abilities, which is also one of the founding stones for language. I'm not really like an animal cognition researcher myself. I had like one collaboration with animal cognition researchers, and we compared the vocabularies that parrots produced and that young children produce. We identified some similarities, some differences, but that's as far as I get with animal cognition. But it's really like an interesting area to study when people want to understand more of human language, actually.
Yeah, for sure. So let's leave them there, then go back to babies, because, as we're discussing in the beginning, we're discussing babies, then we circled to other things, and now we can go back to them. And before you solve the pub quiz question, I just was also wondering about the methodology. So how do you actually get those babies to show you all the things you want to see? You are sitting in the lab, so I can see some pictures there. So there are babies, there are proofs that babies came to your lab.
Yeah.
But that must be so difficult to be studying them.
So there are many babies, wonderful babies, and parents who come to the lab with the babies. It's not so difficult, I would say. I mean, it's a bit more difficult than with adults. The most difficult part is the recruitment, of course, because with adults, you usually take the hundreds of students at the university, right, which is also not entirely like representative, not at all representative of the adult population. But I mean, at least some part of the adult population is really easy to get. With the babies, I mean, it really works like to do outreach about language development and social cognitive development. And adults who are interested in the development of their children, they will read those things, watch those things, and will also be interested in contributing to the advancement of the knowledge. We also have like many toys and everything, so they really like. Very important is once they come, they should really like it here and then return and tell all their friends to come here as well. So this snowball method also works very well with this population. These are these kids that you're seeing in the pictures behind me. They are like babies 3 months old and older. And we also test much younger babies. And that's even easier, I would say, because these like 3 months plus, they already want to move. I mean, 3 months is still okay, but 6 months plus, they are like want to move a lot and everything. So you really have to have a good experiment design where in a very short time you get the data that you need. So usually these experiments take like 3 to 5 minutes for these three months plus. It's like 3 to 5 minutes behavioral experiment. You sit them on a chair on their parents' lap. You play them a few words or sentences, show them some pictures, and then it's done. So in those few trials, you really need to tap into what you need to tap into. And this usually works like with a habituation and dishabituation paradigms when we use behavioral designs, where, for instance, when we want to find out whether children prefer their native language over foreign one, or their native accent over foreign accent, or whether they recognize the difference between two words. So we play them one of the stimulus types for some time, and then they get habituated. So they get bored of the same thing over and over again. And when we change it, and it's really a slight change, for instance, native and foreign accent, we want to see whether children at all react to it, whether they notice it. So when we change it, if they notice it, they will look again and they will be attentive again because they notice the change and they like new things. And if they keep being bored, then it means they probably didn't notice the change. So this is one of the ways how we can test. And also we test with neuroimaging methods like the functional near-infrared spectroscopy and the EEG. And that's very suitable for very young children. And we do many studies with newborns in the hospital and maternity ward, because here in the Czech Republic, women usually stay at least 3 days in a hospital. So they have lots of time to do fun stuff there.
Well, if you say so.
And we have like a very good collaboration with one of the hospitals and with the pediatrician there who recruits the mothers and explains about the experiment. And then they're very happy to come with their newborn baby to the room, which serves as a lab. The baby sleeps all the time, and we can test like really for an hour with these newborn babies and play them various languages and various accents, words and sentences, and measure how their brain reacts to it.
I would not assume that this might be a bit easier, but you're right. I remember, for also traveling advice, that it's actually better to travel with very small babies because they mainly sleep and they don't want to go out anywhere, right? And later on,
Yeah.
when they are more mobile, it is a little bit more difficult, right?
Exactly.
I would
That's
also expect whatever you attach to them, they will not be very happy to have this
they
attached.
protest, like when they are really 3 months plus, they protest with the caps and everything, while the really little ones, you just put it on and they're happy.
Okay, good to know. We said very little ones, not hinting at anything, but I think this is the moment to solve the pub quiz question, right? So if you can remind our listeners what the question was about and then tell us the answer.
So the question was, at what age do babies start learning their native language? And the answer is before they are born.
Yeah, how do you know that, first of all?
We do a lot of research with newborn babies, so who are really like 1 day old, 1 to maximum 3 days, because that's when they go home then. And we test how their brains react to the native language, to the foreign language. And what we focus on is also most recently is how they process native language speech, which has a native accent, so a native like rhythm. And the same native language speech by the same speakers, same sentences, same words, but with a slightly different rhythm, like a bit foreign-like rhythm. And we find that already at birth, the baby's brains react differently to the native rhythm and to the foreign rhythm, to the native and foreign accent. And since they are so young, they must have learned it before. I mean, they must have learned it before we test them. And since they spent like 3 months in the womb prenatally with already so developed ears and neural pathways, auditory pathways, which allow them to process and to learn from auditory signals, then it's very likely that they learned a lot of it even before they were born. And it's not only our studies. I mean, there's been studies by other labs also much earlier with newborns and also with fetuses, where they tested reactions to certain linguistic stimuli. And the research repeatedly shows that babies really get tuned in to their native language before they are born. And what they get tuned in is this rhythm and melody. Because when you consider what the auditory speech signal sounds like inside the belly, inside the womb, then it's like muffled, very much muffled, so you can't really detect or hear the individual words. That you don't hear the words clearly, but what you hear clearly is these low frequencies and where it's slow or fast. So the rhythms and the melodies, that's what you hear very well, and that's what people get tuned in for the surrounding language already before they are born.
Don't they get tuned in more to the mother's voice rather than the native language sounds?
Yeah, that's why it's called mother tongue, right? Because it's most of the input is from the mother, because one thing is they are with the mother all the time when they are in her belly. So most of the speech comes from her that they hear. I mean, they hear all her speech that she produces. And also they don't hear the mother's voice or the mother's speech only like through the channel from outside, but also it resonates in all her body as she speaks, and it's transmitted through the bones to the baby's brain.
I'm asking because, again, coming back to my own lay perspective, is that as I'm living here in Luxembourg, I don't really use Polish this much, my native language. So I don't really know whether my kids, when they were in my belly, were really tuned in to the native language, let's say. And I was wondering what kind of an effect it could have on them. That might be also interesting to see, right? That if it's just the sound of the language that the mother mainly speaks, or there is something about the native as such from the others, right? That maybe the child gets. I don't know, just dropping it there as an interesting story, right?
Yeah, you mean like when the mother would speak a different language than the society around?
Yeah, or just that the mother normally speaks, I don't know, let's say English. So are they also then equipped better with the melody of and the rhythm of English as such, or not? Right? Because of
I mean, there was one or maybe more studies with bilingual mothers, and the babies that were born to bilingual mothers were kind of responding to the two languages differently than babies who whose mothers spoke only one of the two tested languages. So certainly all the languages that the mother speaks do something to the baby's brain. I mean, if she speaks them often enough.
Poor babies of mine then. But fair enough.
This is this rhythmic and melodic attunement which happens very early on, really bootstraps further language learning, but it also might not be absolutely necessary, because we also have people who are born to deaf mothers who use sign language, who don't use spoken language. And these children, so when they are born, they have had very limited spoken language input. And then maybe first few months or first few years, they have most of sign language input, because maybe both their parents use sign language. And still, when they get more immersed in the speaking community, these people acquire spoken language without having this really proper prenatal attunement, or maybe having it less than other people, than people whose moms use spoken language. And you wouldn't recognize when they're adults or older children that they're not like first language speakers of the spoken language. These are the codas, the children of deaf adults who are bilingual, like bimodally bilingual very often, and bicultural, which is also an amazing topic.
Yes, totally. Too many amazing topics, right? But for sure, I'm very sure that the listeners got extremely interested. So what remains is just to check what you'll be studying later on. Then we will all easily learn all the possible foreign languages. Let's be a bit idealist here.
I hope so.
And if not, also check out the Movies app. As you mentioned, that's also an interesting counter app, if you want, if we can call it like that, that has a different method. There are loads of methods there. And what is important is to find the one that works for you. But here we also have something that is backed up by research, which is always something that the podcast is always supporting, because it's important that it's evidence-based and not just someone had an idea, right? And what remains is just to thank you, Kateřina, very much for today and for sharing a small part of your world with us.
Thank you, Hannah, for inviting me. And thanks everyone for listening.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, to suggest guests. And of course, remember, we are doing the European series because we are also on Patreon, which means you can support us if you like what we're doing, so we can expand even more. This was Silex, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.